Charles Robinson was born in Islington, London in 1870, the son of the engraver Thomas Robinson. Charles was the oldest of three brothers, and both William and Thomas had careers in illustration, and both also incorporated their mother's maiden name into their own, with William achieving by far the greatest fame and success. In his teens, Charles served a 7-year apprenticeship as a printer and also took art lessons in the evenings. His artistic abilities led to him being offered a place at the Royal Academy in 1892, but he had to refuse the offer as the family couldn't afford the fees. But in 1895, at the age of 25, he had his earliest significant success as an illustrator with an edition of Aesop's Fables. Robinson's images featured heavy but quite gracefully rendered pen and ink monochromes, and although nothing out of the ordinary for the time, they proved successful enough to lead to more of a similar kind. The Child World, written by Gabriel Seaton, was published a year later, and for this book Robinson created pen and ink drawings which were much finer and consequently more expressive than the previous year's offering. And these carefully hatched images were also presented attractively within quite intricate decorative borders. It was also in 1896 that his illustrated edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses was published, with over 100 pen drawings. And although significantly heavier in their linear execution than those created for the Child World, they too were remarkably detailed and featured a wide range of visually absorbing hatching techniques. Robinson married Edith Mary Favat in 1897, and they would go on to have 4 daughters and 2 sons. And in 1898, another 2 books for children featuring his illustrations were published. Lullaby Land, a collection of verse written by Eugene Field, was, as far as I can tell, the first of Robinson's books to be published in the USA. And the varied collection of pen drawings he created for this assignment would have greatly increased the reach and popularity of his illustrations outside Britain. The second commission of that year was King Longbeard and Other Fairy Tales by Barrington MacGregor, and like the Eugene Field book, the images Robinson produced were densely hatched and surrounded by effective, well-considered decorative borders. But the same year saw the publication of Robinson's visualisation of a selection from the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen, a commission which had the distinction of being the only one shared with his brothers, which, although another essentially monochrome publication, actually featured a full-colour frontispiece. Charles Perrault's Tales of Past Times was published in 1900, and that too had a colour frontispiece, but the rest of the pages were all black and white. And in this instance he returned to noticeably heavier line work with a formal composition redolent of the medievalist styling made popular by Walter Crane. In 1902 Robinson had his first significant foray into full-colour illustration with a collection of alarmingly atypical images for the book Nonsense, Nonsense, written by Walter Gerald. They featured particularly heavy calligraphic line work and large areas of flat or gradient colour, with an apparent disregard for plausible anatomy not seen previously in his output. But 1903's The Big Book of Nursery Rhymes, another by Walter Gerald, was a different matter entirely. This collection played to Robinson's real strengths with a series of far more subtle, visually appealing colour renders, which demonstrated what he was really capable of in the production of fantasy work for children. Not only was his combination of fine ink line and watercolour wash satisfyingly three-dimensional and solid, but the evocation of character and personality in his various subjects was completely unrecognisable from the inexpressive doodles of the Nonsense book. Even so, in 1905 he returned to simplicity and graphic formality, but with considerably more success than before, for the Black Cat book, which played engagingly with virtual silhouettes and attractive patterned compositions. And others of a similar nature were also produced in the years that followed. A year later he published the first in a limited series of very small format picture books, The Awful Airship. They were all just 6 by 3 inches, and loath as I am to criticise the work of someone of Robinson's obvious talents, I have to say that I find these just as puzzling and casually executed as his earlier Nonsense book. The Child's Christmas in 1907 was at least something of a return to more expressive form, with flat graphic duotones and a small number of full-colour renders. In the same year, Robinson joined the ranks of others who created visualisations of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, and just like the others, he couldn't completely break free of the templates laid down by John Tenniel's Victorian originals. The monochromes he produced were atmospheric, well imagined and suitably sinister in tone, but the colour work was far from the standard he had established with his nursery rhyme images. But his greatest creative success of 1907 was undoubtedly The Story of a Weathercock by Evelyn Sharp, which featured several engrossing full-colour images of considerable visual engagement and enduring appeal, as well as red and black duotones and a collection of particularly finely executed and deliberately uncluttered monochromes, all of which made great aesthetic use of white space to focus the viewer's attention. In 1909, Robinson turned his hand to religious subject matter with a collection of suitably sedate visualisations of various telling moments from the early Old Testament for the children's book In the Beginning by S. B. Macy, published by the Religious Tract Society. His edition of Grimm's Tales was published in 1910, but it only contained a total of 4 colour pages, of which I managed to find just 3 to show. And I'm sure there would have been monochromes too, but I failed to find a single example. But to compensate for this unfortunate shortfall, I found at least a few more for the following year's Big Book of Fairy Tales, another book written by his frequent collaborator Walter Gerald. This book contained full-colour pages depicting many of the iconic moments from these classic tales, drawn from many sources, including several from the Brothers Grimm. And I have no idea where it was published, but it was also in 1910 that he created this exquisite neoclassical fantasy scene, demonstrating just how subtle his line and watercolour work could be. Among other commissions at this time was a 1911 edition of Francis Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, and the colourwork he produced for this edition were highly atmospheric and captured the subtlety of this book for children with a collection of desaturated, quite melancholic and occasionally sinister images. And the same was true of his wistful visualisation of Percy Shelley's 1820 poem The Sensitive Plant, which was published in the same year and also boasted some particularly fine Beardsley-inspired monochromes. This was no carefree romp among the bluebells, and Robinson picked up on the darker and occasionally doom-laden tone of Shelley's writing with great symbiotic effect. Despite its large volume of pictures, this was sold as an expensive gift book for adult readers, and the same was true of others illustrated by Robinson and his contemporaries at this time in Britain. Although his subtle watercolour renders and equally expressive fine pen drawings were undoubtedly dominant in his output, Robinson hadn't completely abandoned the more graphic approach he had used with such mixed results in his earlier career. Among the books rendered in this way were several about life in what were, or at least had been, British colonies around the world, and mercifully they avoided his wilder cartoon approach in favour of more representational anatomy. At this time, Robinson was arguably his most productive, and in 1912 he had no less than 4 more illustrated books published, all of them showcasing his watercolour technique. William Blake's Songs of Innocence was credited as being decorated by Charles and his wife Mary, who I can only assume created the graphic embellishments, while Charles provided the illustrations. And all elements were suitably delicate in their execution. But other than this joint credit, all others were entirely the creation of Charles, including a translation of Anatole France's children's fantasy, Bee, Princess of the Dwarfs. Again, the images were produced with fine line and watercolour, and a fairly subdued palette, with some particularly agreeable and even comic character work for the dwarfs in the narrative. Emily Handaside's The Four Gardens was a collection of short stories whose narrative centred around a range of different gardens, each with its own singular qualities. And Robinson more than rose to the challenge of this commission with a series of full-colour illustrations which evoked the impossible beauty of these environments with an authority that surely must have been born of serious botanical observation. Most of these, although not all, featured characters set within the flowers and vegetation, and he used his prowess with watercolours to produce highly plausible effects of light and shade to add yet more authenticity and atmosphere. And this impossibly prolific year concluded with a second visit to the Fables of Aesop, yet another rewritten by Walter Gerald and retitled The Big Book of Fables. Unlike his earlier monochrome visualisation, these were full-colour pen and wash images, which despite the greater success of his brother Thomas and others of the Golden Age such as Dulac and Rackham, were every bit as skillful and expressive, with his enviable command of the medium. Every image picked out particularly telling moments from each of these moralistic stories, and whether populated by humans, animals or both, each one possessed its own appeal and distinctive qualities. It was yet another in what had been to date a remarkably prolific run of successes, which rightly placed him in the upper echelons of book illustrators in Britain at the time. He followed this astonishing body of work a year later with another perfect vehicle for his talents in the form of Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince and Other Tales. And the wide-ranging nature of Wilde's fantasies brought out the best in his visual imagination, with single figures in impossibly romantic settings being the primary visual approach. But in 1914 the Great War began. At 44 years of age, Robinson was much too old to be considered suitable for slaughter, but he patriotically enlisted with the Volunteer Training Corps. In 1915 he did have one solitary book published, which had presumably already been completed before the war actually began. This was the Songs and Sonnets of William Shakespeare, and it was another creative triumph for Robinson, boasting a collection of remarkably atmospheric, romantic and wistful images to accompany the various verses. In virtually every case, Robinson opted to use a single figure set within some form of bucolic scenery, admittedly by now something of a trademark device, and all were rendered with the lightest and most expressive of touches. But his next would not be published until 1918, when the war had ended. This was Phyllis Austin's children's underwater fantasy, The Goldfish Bowl, which featured a relatively small number of line drawings and even fewer colour pages. In the post-war years, this increasingly became the trend, as the old gift book concept was replaced with less expensive publications. So the same was true of the following year's Bridget's Fairies by Mrs. Sinclair Stevenson, with just 4 colour pages and a few cheaper to reproduce pen and ink illustrations. In this now less generous market, Robinson, like others, increasingly found himself working for the many children's annuals of the period. And among other such commissions, in 1920 he created a quartet of breathtaking watercolour images, each of which represented one of the 4 seasons of the year. All were populated with neoclassical fantasy characters, and in a rapidly changing visual environment, as more modernist techniques were starting to appear, these beautifully rendered works may have been considered somewhat anachronistic, but their skillful render and aesthetic charms could not be denied or ignored. In 1922 he illustrated Doris and David All Alone by Elizabeth Mark, for which I found very little, but suspect that again there wasn't actually that much to find. And the same was true of 1925's Once in a Time by Winnie the Pooh author A. A. Milne, although what I could find was charmingly executed and rendered as always. A 1928 edition of Mother Goose Nursery Rhymes contains significantly more colour pages than any of his other recent commissions, and despite the title, these images were actually very appealing illustrations of popular English expressions, which were intended to represent the underlying moral lesson of the actual rhymes. The same year saw the publication of his illustrated edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, with just 4 colour pages, which were far from his best work given the potential of the narratives. By the time the 1930s rolled around, Robinson had increasingly turned to the creation of watercolours as art, and I don't know how much commercial success they enjoyed, but they were yet more clear demonstrations of his facility with this medium, and in this context created without the safety net of pen line work. And although it was unfortunately the case that by now he had, like others, fallen out of favour in the very market he had helped to make so buoyant and profitable, the admittedly far less frequent illustration commissions he did undertake showed that his work was of no less quality than his earlier projects. But in 1937 he was suddenly taken ill, and he died not long after at the age of 67. I'm fairly ashamed to confess that my lifelong unconditional admiration for William Heath Robinson had led me over the years to rather ignore Charles's contribution, which with hindsight I realise is probably no less significant in the scheme of things. And although nobody could knock William off the pedestal of my admiration, the work of Charles now comes a very close second. I remain moderately disdainful of his attempts at graphic simplicity, but this is more than compensated for by the remarkable qualities of his more subtle monochromes and watercolours.